I'm going to read a passage from my philosophical treatise on the philosophy of mind and the philosophy of mental illness called In Defense of the Mind. And the passage goes as follows. If a person is unhappy with their life and in a kind of deep psychological pain, they should be fully aware of why this is the case. If the psychological pain is so severe that all they can think about is suicide, I think this becomes difficult, but I still think that a person who is suicidal must be responsible for understanding why they are suicidal to begin with. They must think about how their action would impact others, how it would impact the future life they would have, among other considerations. Now, I have a interesting understanding of suicide. On the one hand, I don't condone suicide. I think that suicide is the incorrect course of action to take. And yet, nonetheless, I feel strongly that if a person wants to commit suicide, they should have a right to do so because it is their life, and they shouldn't be thwarted or stopped by outside influences. Now, that being said, suicide is a very complicated matter. Suicide is, in fact, difficult to talk about. And one of the main things that I want to bring to your attention is the way in which people who are suicidal are stigmatized and shamed, and how this prevents us from having an honest discussion about suicide and how suicide actually works, and what suicide is and why people commit suicide in the first place. This is why with the passage that I chose to read, I emphasize this idea about how the person must be conscious of why they're suicidal and understanding why they're suicidal. So essentially they're using dualistic existentialism, they're using metacognition to be fully responsible for their thoughts and their behavior. And this is extremely important to the notion of suicide. Now, for me personally, I have in the past struggled with suicidal thoughts, but the reason why I ultimately would never do so is because I do believe in this program of dualistic existentialism, of metacognition and thinking through your motives and understanding why you would want to commit suicide and what your reasons are for wanting to commit suicide. And I've worked out the logic of suicide, and I found out that it's not for me. Now, of course, the difficulty is the fact that when you're in the moment, suicidal thoughts can be very impulsive. Suicide itself can be a very impulsive act. But nonetheless, this is why I stress dualistic existentialism and being conscious of your thoughts and why you want to commit suicide. Now, this is normative thinking because in real life it may be very, very hard or even impossible to reason with someone who is suicidal. Nonetheless, I think that the problem with the way that we look at people who are suicidal is we see them as having no will. We see them as having no will to life, and we thus shame them and we stigmatize them. And I argue in my book, In Defense of the Mind, that this is the wrong way to go because we are essentially not being fair to why the person is suicidal. What we need to do is try to understand the psychological state of the suicidal person in order to understand why they have gotten to the point to where they've gotten at, and not simply blame them or stigmatize them. I go in depth in this book a little bit more. I reference David Foster Wallace. I talk about Mitchell Heisman, and so there's various points that can be mentioned in terms of suicide and why people ultimately commit suicide. But if there's anything I want you to take home, it's this idea that we can't stigmatize and shame people simply because they are suicidal. What we need to do is try to understand why they are in that mindset. And again, I would point out that that's the problem with Western medicine, is this notion that we force people to live without understanding why they want to commit suicide to begin with. So again, that makes a really odd tension between my idea of a suicidal person having the right to end their life, but also my emphasis on dualistic existentialism and the idea that the person should be responsible for their decisions and their behavior. How this works is difficult, but that's why the tension is there, and the tension is alive and well in philosophy, especially the philosophy of suicide, and more generally and broadly the philosophy of mind. This is Phoenix, and thank you.